I think, if the founders came back today, as the conservative scholar Yuval Levin says, they'd be not surprised that somebody was trying to take on monarchical attitudes, but that the legislative branch, which that's Article 1, had abdicated.
What's up, everybody? Happy almost July 4th, almost America 250. Welcome to another special episode of Independent Americans. I'm, of course, your host, Paul Rieckhoff, coming to you from Cape May, New Jersey, and Uncle Bill's Pancake House, one of the best places on the planet for pancakes and breakfast. If you've never been here, I highly recommend it. We got the beach out there, people riding by, carousel, American flag. It's a great time to be in America. The U.S. with a fantastic win last night in the World Cup to move on to the round of 16. And we've got a very special America 250 episode for you, a replay of one of my favorite conversations with the great Ken Burns, a man who knows about American history, who knows about the revolution, who knows about true patriotism, and is one of the greatest storytellers you'll ever hear from. I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did. Please be sure to subscribe everywhere you're listening or watching on YouTube, Spotify. Take us in the car with you. Listen to all the episodes from this week, and we have a very special pre-Independence Day, July 4th, new conversation coming tomorrow with Governor Wes Moore of Maryland. He's going to share his 4th of July message. He's going to talk about the push for open primaries in Maryland, and we're going to talk about what America is all about. It's an inspiring one to take you into a huge July 4th in America 250. So from here in Cape May and Uncle Bill's and the beach, happy almost 4th of July, happy almost Independence Day and Independence Day, and of course, stay vigilant. Stay vigilant, my friends. And go USA! Welcome to Independent Americans. Welcome to episode 354. I'm your host, Paul Rieckhoff. This is a very important time in American history, maybe a revolutionary time in American history. We're going to get into much of that, baseball, and much more with one of our favorite returning guests, a true American icon and a voice of conscience. Back on Independent Americans, the great and powerful Ken Burns is rejoining us again on the show. Welcome back, sir.
Hello, my friend. How are you? Thank you for having me.
I'm always so happy to talk to you, and I feel a bit relieved. I feel like a student visiting a very beloved professor.
No, I'm Paul Revere galloping up and not saying the regulars are coming out. The regulars are coming out. He didn't say the redcoats are coming. The regulars are coming out. The regulars are coming out. But because I bring some special messages from the revolution.
I am excited to hear more of those messages. I am dying to talk to you about baseball.
Yeah.
I'd like to talk to you about kind of this moment in America and this discussion of what it means to be American, what it means to be a leader, what it means to be a man, even as which is being
Oh,
questioned,
what a good, yes, indeed. Yeah.
right? But before that, I always ask our guests, where are you and how are you? You're in New Hampshire again.
I'm in my home in New Hampshire, in my barn, which is relatively new, 13 years. I built this 13 years ago, but it's meant to feel like it's 150 years old. It's up in the loft where I've been working since before COVID and never went back to my office above the garage. I'm here with my executive producer, the polar bear on an iceberg, Chester, who's my guy, sitting underneath not a flag, but the United States flag as a Navajo blanket, which makes it a much more complicated and interesting story.
And Ken, how are you? It's a
I'm
dynamic,
good. I'm
trying
good.
time in America, and you've got this incredible project, the American Revolution. But
Yes.
how are you?
I'm good. I mean, I think like everybody, there's this kind of pervasive existential worry about things as we watch sort of columns that are supporting the edifice of democratic institutions and democratic society sort of crumbling or being toppled. But at the same time, I think that there's hope, and the future at commencement addresses, everybody says, "Don't tell them their future lies ahead of them," and I won't. I will tell you the future lies behind us. Harry Truman said, "The only thing that's really new is the history you don't know." And I went in as someone who's spent my entire professional life telling stories in American history, thinking, "Oh, I revolution," and it's like every day of the last nearly 10 years has been a humiliation or a humbling where you go,
Mm.
wow, I had no idea. And so I get to share the work of an extraordinary group of colleagues and myself and say to you, wow, I never knew that.
Mm. I want to get to the American Revolution just because you mentioned it. You mentioned the blanket behind you. You are an expert and a teacher on so many different things. There was a recent announcement that medals would be awarded for Wounded Knee, what has widely been understood as a massacre. This was a huge reversal from the Secretary of Defense. I know you're careful about engaging in politics, but you understand history, and this feels like a moment that is about rewriting history.
It
Uh,
is, it is, and I think that's the most disturbing part of it is that it doesn't acknowledge, the variety of people that went into creating our country, the variety of people engaged in the ongoing drama that is called American history, which is incredibly complex and more interesting the more complex you allow it to be, less interesting the more you edit it. And I just find that a kind of, obvious, racist, editing, and we just there's no place for it right now. We've made extraordinary progress. We only have to get better. The whole idea of America is like a process word, right? We're in pursuit of happiness. We are after a more perfect union. That whenever you stop that sense of the story of us is a process of becoming, and you think that somehow you have to go back to some earlier time when what? There was slavery. What? When we were massacring the people who were the original inhabitants of this, unarmed in most cases, in the case of Wounded Knee, women and children. This is not a good sign. It's not a good harbinger. It's being able to confront the complexity of things and not vote the way authoritarians always vote, which is to simplify it and make sure the trains run on time in every sense of that word, metaphorically and precisely, but to understand the messiness of democracy and realizing that it's all an exchange and a negotiation, that the people who disagree with you are not your enemies, but in fact, just the other side of the coin, a coin that you were occupying that other side not that far long ago. And so I think the problem with the kind of defiance of renaming the forts after Confederate heroes, however nimbly you think you're doing it, it is just step backwards, and it's a slap in the face of a lot of Americans. And so I think we just got to be on guard a little bit more.
I want to come back to that, but I promised myself and my producer Chris that we would start with baseball
Okay,
because it's so much heavy stuff that we're going to get into. We always get into, but I think it's kind of a new golden age for baseball. It feels so exciting,
so exciting.
and I'm wearing my Yankees jersey. We're recording this on Wednesday tonight. I'm going to Yankee Stadium with my boys. You will appreciate that I wear a number 8 when I go, which is the great Yogi Berra,
It ain't over till it's over.
right? And also a decorated World War II veteran. And I want to just let you talk about
And I knew Yogi. He was a tremendous human being. We had an ongoing fight over whether Jackie was safe or out at home. He thought out, I thought safe, and we'd argue about this over lots of different things in lots of different places, including the White House, where he'd shout out and I'd shout safe, and everybody's going like
but at the White House,
at the White
you're
House.
at one side of the room and Yogi Berra is on the other side.
Actually, we were exiting the East Wing, and he was in a bus being taken back all the Hall of Famers. There were three civilians, non-Hall of Famers, besides the president, George W. Bush. It was Bob Costas and Billy Crystal and me, which was put us in pretty rare. I thought I was the odd man out, but Yogi kept saying out, and Ernie Banks just said he still thinks Jackie's out like that, and
See,
so
these are the Ken Burns stories I love, right? These are
yeah.
the stories that this is why we do the podcast, so we can get an insight into that world. But there's a piece of Yogi and this moment that I want to ask you specifically to talk about. I've been talking a lot about leadership in America, and
Yeah.
especially what boys and young men can look up to as leaders. And you think about someone like Yogi Berra, and I look at baseball as actually kind of a refreshing outlier because let's just use someone like Aaron Judge and someone like Shohei Ohtani, who are gentlemen, who are respectful, who are disciplined, who are wonderful at their craft. But most of all, I feel like my kids are lucky to be growing up at a time in New York where they have someone like an Aaron Judge, and we can respect someone like Shohei Ohtani. But it's also just great baseball. You've got the Brewers in the playoffs, and you've got these epic clashes happening between the Guardians and the Tigers. But what do you think of this moment in baseball in the
It's
playoffs?
just wonderful, and I'll tell you, we're Red Sox family and have been for since I moved to New England in 1971. My girls are my young ones are so caught up in it this year. I've got a 20-year-old in Florence studying, a junior semester abroad. I got a 14-year-old and son-in-law and grandchildren, and we're all, living and dying by each pitch and each strike. It's wonderful. We know it's the greatest game that's ever been invented, and I'll tell you, it is much more complex than we think, and it's not the oasis from all of this. I mean, Stengel, who basically invented the garbled language that Yogi would adopt, told a commentator in our baseball series, "I never play a game without my man. I never play a game without my man."
Mm.
And what he meant was Yogi Berra. And it had to do with who it is. You look when Bill Mazeroski's home run is going over the head of a center fielder in Pittsburgh. That's Yogi, who's playing center field because he needs a day off from hurting his knees. I mean, he played in 71, I think, World Series games. I mean, or how maybe he hit 71 time. I mean, he's just got an amazing thing, and he was an unbelievable leader. And we look to baseball. I saw our baseball series as a sequel to the Civil War because what's the first real progress in civil rights after the Civil War fought ostensibly for the extension of civil rights in America? It's when Jack Roosevelt Robinson, a grandson of a slave, walked out to play first base at Ebbets Field on April 15th, 1947. I mean, and now every April 15th, every single player wears the number 42. It's an amazing tribute to one of the most important people in the history of this country. So it's not this side thing. I remember when I started it, there was no traction. People just thought of as a what you can do in history of baseball.
Mhm.
Even the scholars who were mining the field, understandably, for all the great stuff, were sort of set apart as if it wasn't really a legitimate discipline. It's a
Mhm.
legitimate discipline. The sports tell us so much. And so we've gone on to do films about Jack Johnson and Muhammad Ali, as well as an individual film standalone on Jackie, an update of the baseball series called The 10th Inning. And so I think and right now we are at the heart of just the best kind of playing. It's just wonderful. It's given us such great pleasure.
Mm. And a shared experience, right?
That's it. Well, you know what? I'll tell you,
Right?
let's not get it wrong. I
Yeah.
love basketball. I love football. They're great games. I know where most of my Sundays in the fall get wasted or used up. However, a football story begins. Joe Montana threw a pass to Jerry Rice with just a few seconds left, and we went ahead and we won. Or Michael Jordan hit the three-pointer at the buzzer, tongue wagging, and we won. But a baseball story always says, as your kids will tell this years later, you know, my dad took us to the stadium in the second game of the playoff series, and we lost, but I'll never forget my dad holding my
They didn't
hand
lose. They
and
didn't
the
lose in this
breeze.
story, Ken. They didn't lose.
I'm
It
trying to
started
give
the
you a hard
World
time.
Series run.
Yeah, that it's all about that, It's all about who you see it with, whose hand you're holding at the rim of the Grand Canyon, another kind of park. But, it's just interesting that the sport has you have to put it in relationship to time and memory and most important emotion. And that's at the heart of our experience of this great game. I mean, a 300 hitter means the same thing to my great great grandfather who fought in the Civil War
Mm.
as it does to my kids and my grandkids. And there's very few things that have that kind of continuity in American life.
And Ken, I especially now as a father, I find it to be such a useful teaching machine, right? I mean, you talk about Jackie Robinson explaining to my boys why everyone wears 42,
Yeah,
explaining Jackie Robinson's struggle, even talking about the geography of these different cities and how they've evolved
that's
over
correct.
time. I took them to the Hall of Fame this summer for the first time, and we recognized the players who had served in World War II, have a little note next to their plaque, right? So it becomes a teaching mechanism for so many things. And it's also a bit of a I don't know, almost like a springboard or a reflection on our politics. And what I think about specifically was 9/11 in New York, right? There's always a specialness to the 9/11 game in New York, and there's always a question: where is Trump going to be? And Trump, I know is so radioactive in so many ways, but what he did was so interesting and I think shrewd politically. He didn't go to ground zero. He went to Yankee Stadium to get a picture with Aaron Judge and the Yankees, in
Right.
part because he knew he wouldn't get booed. Like, right, there's kind of a sacredness to the 9/11 game, especially at Yankee Stadium. But even that 9/11 game became a teaching moment for folks who maybe don't know what happened on 9/11.
Yes, right.
My boys didn't recognize that they always wear the FDNY hats and the NYPD hats, and maybe they will 100 years from now.
They will.
This is going to be a wild summer of politics, news, and elections. Primaries continue to roll on. We have the biggest midterms ever. The intersection of sports and politics is happening every single day. And you can trade on the biggest political races and activities on Kalshi. On Kalshi, you can trade major primaries, election outcomes, and the biggest political storylines as they happen, leading up to the biggest midterms ever. You can pick who's going to control Congress. You can pick who's going to win the Senate race in Maine, Graham Pletner or Susan Collins. You can bet on the World Cup. You can trade on the World Cup and much more. It's all on Kalshi. You're trading against peers in a live market, meaning there's no house. And as the probability changes, you can buy in and out of your position. For a limited time, download the Kalshi app and use the code for this show, independent, and get $10 when you trade 10. Kalshi, Kalshi, where you can trade on anything, including just about everything you hear about on here on Independent Americans. 18 and only, 18 and over only. Restrictions and eligibility requirements apply. Even contract trading involves risk and may not be suitable for all investors. Prices, values, and available markets may differ from those mentioned. For more information, see kalshi.com/regulatory. But check out our friends at Kalshi, who are big supporters of independent Americans, and go to Kalshi, where you can trade on just about anything, and they'll help you stay vigilant. But it's also changed quickly, right? These rules changes, I think, are part of what has opened up the game. You've got the pitch clock, you've got the shorter bases, you got the less stepping out of the box. Baseball was sacred, but they've changed these rules in a way that have brought it into the next era, and it feels like kind of what America needs to do. In some,
We all these things, including a vibrant democracy, change and expand and reflect the sort of needs of the period of the time, and that's why baseball, which has accompanied most of the generations of the history of the United States, is a much finer barometer. Say you want to study immigration. First
Mm,
stars are English, then Irish, then German, then Italian, and belatedly African American and Jewish, and Hispanic and Asian. I mean, that's the story of immigration in America in a nutshell, like that, right? Um, a piece of paper you get from the State Department is okay, really important, but no, being participating in the national pastime of your adopted country is a kind of form of citizenship, and baseball is a way in for many people. It is, a political metaphor. It is, and what I talk about, my work. I have my own politics, but I don't put that in my films. And what I always say is, we call balls and strikes, right?
mm,
And let's just think, in our media society, everything is reduced to a highlight. So, Aaron Judge, you only see the home run going out. You don't see that a little bit under 7 times out of 10, he strikes out or he grounds out. That he only comes up once every 9 times at bat, and sometimes it takes the, shortstop or the second baseman to hit the
mm.
home run, right? I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
this is what it is, and so I think with regard to our film on the revolution, that's what we're doing. We're calling balls and strikes, and we're giving dimension and importance to the most important person in the whole story, George Washington, but he's no longer a marble statue, as the historian Jane Kamensky says in her film. He's got dimension. He's real. He's flawed.
Mm,
He's rash. He makes some terrible tactical errors, but we don't have a country without him. And there's no other person you can say that about. But then, because he's part of the 0.1%, 0.01% that have their pictures painted, um, we introduce you to scores of other people, teenagers who join the Patriot Army, 14-year-old, 15-year-old, a little girl who's a refugee from Yorktown for most of the war, 10 years old, women, Native people, free and enslaved blacks, Spanish, French, Dutch, all the King of England and his ministers and his general and their generals and their ordinary foot soldiers from Wales or Scotland or Ireland or England. I mean, it is just a wonderfully dynamic thing. The German soldiers, their wives, what's going on, and all the variations of patriots and loyalists. Remember, this is a civil war, right?
mhm,
This is
mhm,
not just a revolution where it's us complaining about the British and thinking great thoughts. That happens, but we have people who are actively fighting against us, who are our neighbors, called loyalists, and we don't make them wrong. To be a loyalist is to be a conservative. To
mm.
say, look, the British constitutional monarchy is the best form of government on earth. They are right. All my prosperity, health, literacy, land that I own has had to do in large measure from that. Why would I change for some crazy radical idea? That crazy radical idea turned out to be the United States of America, the best idea. And the most important event since the birth of Christ is the American Revolution. And I think on November 16th, we can prove it.
November 16th is when it premieres, right? On
On
PBS and
PBS
everywhere
and
else.
is released for streaming and
And I
DVD.
think all of your work underscores the tremendous national and international value of PBS and public television, in my view. But let me ask you to build off of one kind of part of this, Ken. I think one of the most important magic qualities and vital value that Ken Burns brings to America is you are teaching patriotism. You are teaching it in a way that's not political, that's not jingoistic, at a time where patriotism feels a little bit radioactive at times. And I want to ask you to build on that because you're going to
Good.
Joe Rogan, you're going to every media place,
Yeah, and
and
saying the same thing
yeah,
too, by the way. I'm not saying anything to you differently than I said to Joe Rogan, than I said to the editorial board of the New York Times, than I spoke last Friday to school kids in inner city Detroit, right?
hmm.
That's it. I want to do that. So patriotism's an interesting
Can I
thing.
ask you a bit about that though, Ken, before I let you run with that? Like going back to baseball. Um, Baseball, I think, has by default in many communities become the place where you learn maybe the first things about America. Like not every school does the Pledge of Allegiance anymore. I don't know if they teach the national anthem, but kids learn the national anthem at baseball games.
Yeah.
Yankees, Yankee
You know
Stadium.
what the last two words of the national anthem are.
You're gonna put me on the spot here.
No. You think it's the brave.
No, home of the brave. What?
Yeah. It's play ball.
Oh, okay, got it, got it.
Gotcha.
All right. Yeah. Well, I mean, but to that point, Ken, New York is I don't know how many ball stadiums, how many baseball parks do this, but they still do God Bless America in the seventh inning. And there's also a tradition. Like my boys have learned that veterans can salute the national anthem, right? Whether they're in uniform or not. They know how to put their hand over their heart. They know to take their hat off. But there's a degree of respect and community and teaching that I think feels very wholesome. But I
Yes.
also feel like it's fragile. I feel like it's fragile to some extent because of the politicians that come to games and the environment that we're in and who they honor on the Jumbotron, if it's Charlie Kirk or not, right? But can you talk about the importance of baseball in teaching patriotism at a time when patriotism isn't taught much anymore? And if it
Yeah,
is,
it's
feels
not that it's
loaded?
taught, it's just it's kind of been fractured. It's almost like the Fantasia thing with the Sorcerer's Apprentice, where it's being gone into multiple things. And so patriotism is a word applied to Whigs in constitutional monarchy Britain who were devoted to a constitutional parliamentary form of law. So it wasn't just the monarch, but the participation of all of that. So patriots became people who are really keeping the flame alive of what we would say, you know, early Republican with a small r or Democrat with a small d form of government. And it's been overtaken by scoundrels. Dr. Samuel Johnson, British, says lost souls escape their loss of control in patriotism. We also understand from Thomas Paine that a lot of people claim to be patriots who are not and shrink at the first sign of battle. We have people who decide that only a certain political side is a patriot, when in fact, patriotism is a form of devotion to the democratic process, the small d democratic process in the United States. And so we can see the ways in which scoundrels abuse it. We can see the way in which people of great presence, of virtue, of honor, words that are the free electrons of the revolutionary story that are not used today, do it. And one of the things is we look to those institutions, the military, baseball, to help us continue have a sense of continuity. Nobody lets me into Fenway Park asking me if I'm a Democrat or a Republican,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
No one cares. They want me to there. And we do take off our caps. We do put our hands over our heart. We do sing the national anthem. And we do these American rituals, a kind of catechism of democracy. And that makes these institutions really important, particularly in such divided times. But here's the headline: we've always been divided. The revolution was not just the good guys against the bad guys 3,000 miles away, but a civil war, as I said. We've had a civil war of our own, which is really a sectional war that killed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of our own people. You know, we've had times like Vietnam, which I covered in a film, hundreds of bombings taking place in the late 60s and early 70s. I mean, this is really, we can perceive the existential threats to the system, but at the same time, you have to stop and take a step back and say, if you know your history, you know what our North Star is, where we came from and where we should be headed, and what is American and not American. And it's a really wide swath. But the one thing we're not, there's a wonderful comment. We follow this German Hessian, this Hessian soldier, foot soldier, wonderful guy named Johann Ewald. He's unbelievably contemptuous of these radicals and this rabble, he calls them, or the rebels that the British call us. And they come across some writings of Thomas Paine, and he's disdainful of it when they capture Fort Lee in New Jersey, just across on the other side of the George Washington Bridge, before the George Washington Bridge was
Mhm.
built. And named after George Washington, by the way, the most important person in this story. And he's there at Germantown when the fortunes turn against the Patriots, and it's just a fluke, and he can't believe how much it is. But he's there at Yorktown and forced to surrender. And he says, it's hard to believe 100 years ago that out of this multitude of rabble, calling us multitude of rabble, could come a people who could defy kings. I mean,
Mm.
and I'll tell you, those German soldiers
Mm.
who didn't just desert during this thing and blend into German-speaking communities all around Pennsylvania and Maryland and New Jersey and whatever, New York. Um, they went home and then a lot of them came back with their families to
Mm.
settle, because
Mm.
this multitude of rabble had created the best form of government on the planet, which made no distinction, established no religion, had freedom of the press and of assembly, and for the citizens to redress their grievances. That's just all the First Amendment. I've only dealt with the First Amendment, and we're about representative government. And I think, if the founders came back today, as the conservative scholar Yuval Levin says, they'd be not surprised that somebody was trying to take on monarchical attitudes, but that the legislative branch, which that's Article 1, had abdicated, that
Mhm.
had not established itself. So instead of us going, oh, the king, of course everybody's going to move to it. This is what they were sort of reverse engineering the Constitution to try to avoid that. They never thought for a second that the legislative branch would abdicate its responsibility.
And Ken, I'm glad you bring that up, because I don't know if there's been a time in modern history where they've abdicated their responsibility more than right now. And
Never.
I use the examples.
I made a history of the Congress, a film in the late '80s, and the answer is never.
So military action just in the first 9 months in Yemen, Iran, off the coast of Venezuela. We find out that there was military action against North Korea in 2019 in the first Trump administration. Now the expansion of the deployment of federal troops on the border in Los Angeles, soon to be in Chicago and Portland. And what I've said is, the biggest story in America is Donald Trump has total control to do whatever he wants with the most powerful military the world has ever seen. And some of that has included attacking, in my view, First Amendment rights and free speech and twisting religion into our politics in a way that's never been done before. But you're also a great a great teacher of war. I would argue you're one of our best teachers of war. And one of the things I wanted to ask you is this not just symbolic change from the Department of Defense to the Department of War. And Hegseth's speech this week to the generals, which is also unprecedented, but this almost twisting of history that defense is different from war and that we are in the war business, not the defense business. But can you just talk about your thoughts or the historical perspective on this name change, this speech we saw, the address to the UN, the kind of all of it together in this moment?
Yeah, I think it's sad. It feels threatening of the institutions that mean something. Look, it was Department of War up until 1945, and it was a conscious attempt to understand what we were about. That the United States was not a belligerent force in the world, that it was really about how you maintain peace. And that's where the Department of Defense made a lot more sense to other people. And that the combination of the renaming of forts back to the Confederate generals, these were traitors. I mean, Robert E. Lee and his generals were responsible for a lot of deaths of loyal Americans, and the celebration of them and the institution they were trying to defend, slavery, I think are indefensible. And so there's a sadness to that. There's a sadness, I think, also to this, the going back to giving medals to people involved in Wounded Knee, just as a way of spreading salt in an open wound. And maybe that satisfies people in an internet age where it's owning the other side or whatever. But that's not what the United States has been about. It's been about, we made sacrifices in the First World War and saved Europe. Didn't need to. A lot of people wanted us to stay out of the Second World War, but we got into it. And we also, through our manufacturing and our sacrifice, save the world again. That's our job. We're really good at finishing wars. When we start them and when we are sort of a priori belligerent, we've sort of lost our way. That's not what we're about. That's not what Washington asked us to be in his farewell address or his warnings about foreign entanglements. He's very much not America first. He is about adhering to our democratic principles. His great example is, besides holding the country together, which is knowing how to relate to Congress, how to defer to them, how to inspire men in the dead of night, ordinary men, how to pick subordinate leadership that is top notch, not afraid of great generals. Nathaniel Greene as one, Benedict Arnold for a while until his treachery is revealed. Many other people who are smart, Lafayette, Hamilton, people that are at his side. He understands how to do that, and then he's able to convince people to stop a retreat at Monmouth. He runs out on the field at Princeton and runs out of the field at Kips Bay in Manhattan. He's made some bad decisions, but he's also put down mutinies and been able to convince people not to do this. And then he resigns his military commission.
Hmm.
And then he resigns the presidency, setting an example. The American ideal of that the highest office of the land is not president. And John Adams had wanted it to have royal kind of trappings, and he said, "No, President of the United States is enough for me." And then to leave it, George III, who's not the crazy person we make him out to be, says, after learning that he had resigned both things, he said, "Well, then he is the most important character of the age." And I would suggest that that age is still going on and that we can go back, just as somebody, is having struggles with their life. You go back into your story and find out how to make it better. And our origin story is about as inspiring as you could possibly get. And because you're dealing with all of the minutia doesn't mean that you're diminishing those great ideas. Those great ideas are even better in the proud relief of the complication of this story and the engagement of all the different levels. Everybody loves Yellowstone, right? It would be
Hmm.
nothing if it was just Costner in the big house. but no, it's his kids. One's a very strong woman. One's a traitor, like Benedict Arnold.
Mm,
One's, married to a Native American woman. And then there are all the employees from the head guy to down to all the stuff. They're women, they're blacks, they're gay. There's Native Americans, a big, huge force within the state. There's a tension between greed. That the question that the movie It's a Wonderful Life, Jimmy Stewart's favorite film and Frank Capra's favorite film that he directed, in which the simple question: do you want to live in Pottersville or do you want to live in Bedford Falls? Bedford Falls, we help each other. We want to see people's success. We want to welcome immigrants. We want to understand the melting pot of the United States for what it is. Or do you want something in which it's all just acquisitive? It's all just, turning out a profit. It's a kind of Las Vegas of the mind everywhere
mhm,
in the United States. So you've got some choices in history, and history is a wonderful, wonderful example of what works and what doesn't work for us or for the world for that matter. I mean, Jefferson, even late in his life, was worried about Europe. And he would say, even when the light and science of liberty and science in Europe is dimmed, we will stand as a beacon against the, feeble engines of despotism. Feeble engines. They are feeble. They're insecure. They're brash. It's bullying. And George Washington was not a bully. George
mm.
Washington was a wise man who walked into the room and by the accumulated wisdom and the gift of height, um, commanded the room like no other person. And that's why there's a bridge connecting what used to be Fort Washington and Fort Lee called the George Washington Bridge. Why the head of our government is in Washington, D.C., why there's a state name for him, while there's a county in almost every state named Washington, and why, if you look out of the White House, in the southern direction, you see the tallest obelisk in the United States, which is the Washington Monument. And
Ken, what is
so
in this moment of tension and division and concern and anxiety and pockets of hope, what is the message of this new masterpiece work that you've done, or even the message from George Washington that we
I think the message is the same. It's just that if you wish to be healed in this moment of division, if you wish to find or re-engage the story of our founding, our creation myth, is a really good place to start. Where do we come from? What do we believe in? What were the things that animated? What were the kind of sacrifices? We're sitting there and watching the capitulation of the richest men in the country. George Washington may have been the richest man in the country at the time of the Revolution. And at the Declaration, they said we mutually pledge our lives. That means they're willing to give up their life, our fortunes. Oh no, I might be a little less rich if he's mad at me, and our sacred honor. All of which we have to remember what that means. And those are really important. The chances on April 19th, 1775 on Lexington Green of our success against the largest empire on earth, the most far-flung empire on earth, and the greatest naval power and one of the great military powers was zero. And 6.5 years later, in Yorktown, Virginia, in October of 1781, it's 100%.
Mm,
Don't you want to know how that happened? Because George Washington didn't know he was George Washington. Thomas
mm,
Jefferson didn't know he was John Adams, and all the people, the subsidiary people, they didn't know what was going on, and they didn't know how it was going to turn out.
mm,
And just as they're farm kids from Nebraska or Iowa who get off an LST on June 6th, 1944, they're not getting paid much. They are not there for conquest or for territory or for loot or for whatever it is. They are there for an idea. And that idea was born in the moment of our founding, and it has to be reinvigorated, particularly because the feeble engines of despotism are always around and always willing to say, hey, like, take this shortcut, make this person an enemy. I mean, look, I've made films about the US, but I've also made films about us. And if I've learned one thing, there's only us. There's no them. And whenever anyone tells you there's a them, they're not right. Try to
mm,
gently and politely remind them
mm,
there's no them. And we just, the way people advances by trying to convince you that you've got a natural enemy and this person is threatening you is the worst dodge. And it is the dodge of all of human history. I'm sure one of the first conversations that human beings had was a lie, and then also saying, and he's not a good person, right
Mm,
over there. That guy, he's not in our
mm,
interest. And
mm,
that's been the story. I mean, we were interviewing, interrogating out of curiosity. And now I look back at it and kind of embarrassingly so about a highly decorated Marine in our Vietnam film, and trying to get him to tell the story. And finally, he just looked up and he said, "It's the history of the world, right?" And
mm,
that it gave title to our
mm,
eighth of 10 episodes of
mm,
Vietnam. Because
mm.
what he's saying is, and there was a historian couple, Will and Ariel Durant, who figured out that maybe in all of human history, there were, I'm making this number up, like 38 years when there wasn't a war. My feeling is they missed it. There has never been a point when someplace in the world other people aren't killing each other because of that them thing.
That, I'm so thankful for that, all of this conversation, but that segment especially is something I hope that all Americans can hear in this moment. And this idea of sacred honor is something that is so critical right now, and you embody it. Let me ask you a really easy final question, a much different kind of final question. Who's going to win the World Series, Ken Burns?
Well, I think it's the Boston Red Sox.
Okay, if it's not the Boston Red Sox, who else might it be?
It could be the Los Angeles Dodgers, which would be the first repeat since the Yankees' great run in the late 90s,
Yeah,
which we followed in great detail. And what arguably one of the great interviews we did in our updated baseball called The 10th Inning is Joe Torre, who had history with
yeah,
Atlanta, knew how to deal with that, knew how to assuage Steinbrenner about losing the first two games and then coming back and winning and all of that stuff and handling himself magnificently, even in defeat to Arizona in 2001, where the gods
yes.
should have made. And this tells you how incredible this game is. The fix is not in, right? It's
I have
never in.
goosebumps hearing you say it
You
because I
know what I mean?
remember saying, "We gotta win. We had 9/11."
We had 9/11, we have to win, and then that's
Oh,
not the way it works. You know, our founders were deists, Paul. They're so interesting. And they came from different Protestant, and some Catholic denominations. And there were other people in the mix, lots of native, languages, lots of, and religions, and African nativist and Muslim and some Jews. But the founders were primarily Protestant and a handful of Catholics. But many of them migrated to this deism that saw that there was a creator, divine providence, the supreme architect, God, whatever it might be, who created things but is disinterested in the affairs of men. So when your baseball player crosses home plate and thanks God for hitting into the, hitting the grand slam home run, God didn't have anything to do with that, right? And the same, just as the only time I've ever seen a player do it is when Pedro got yanked once from a game against the Yankees, and he looks up, and I thought, great,
yep.
finally somebody. I had a chance to tell him that how grateful I was. But there's a disinterested God who does not distinguish between faiths. Thomas Jefferson said, "If my neighbor believes in 20 gods or no God at all, it neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg." And if you go back to all those wars, so much of it is based not just on he's a bad guy, but he believes differently about what's up there, even though every religion is about the same thing, can be reduced to the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. All of them are essentially about that variation on that theme. And so it's interesting to read the writings of deists and to set up a country, first country on earth, that doesn't establish a particular religion, just says, you believe what you believe. The state is not going to interfere in that. It's it's a great thing. And so what really right-thinking Americans do is they replace that with another national religion called baseball.
Baseball. There it is. There it is. Well, um, someone once said to me, "If America was a religion, veterans would be the clergy." And I feel like if there was a clergy, you would be an honored, esteemed elder of that clergy. You are such an American icon, but also a treasure and such a great public servant. And I am so grateful for your sacrifice, but most of all for your leadership. And at a time when this country needs a tone that is right, you strike the right tone. Always, Ken, and it's such an example for our country and for our children, and I just wanna thank you for that. I wanna celebrate your latest masterpiece, The American Revolution. Everybody should see it, on November 16th, and share it far and wide. My 4th grader is studying the American Revolution
Great, great,
and
perfect
can't
time.
wait, so our entire family is excited. Thank you to Chester, who is completely zonked out behind you. That's a good reason to watch this show on YouTube. But thank you for having us into your home and into your life, Ken, and most of all, into your heart. Um,
Thank you, Paul. It's always great to spend some time with you. Really, blessings to you and your family. Have
thank
a
you,
good
sir.
have
And
a good
back to you, and go Yanks.
Go Sox.
Thanks, Ken.
Archipelago, he tells me the left and right are dreams for those without a clue. And when you wake, it's time to grow. And it's not cool to believe in school, but if I can say one thing, I've seen the children of the revolution and the good trouble they can bring. He says the red and blue are dead and independent is an attitude. An island in the sea of rhetoric and archipelago, he tells me the left and right are dreams for those without a clue. And when you wait, it's time to grow.
Powered by Righteous Media.